Extensive plyos are used a ton in the industry. Many coaches are using them to improve the capacities of their athletes, and most of the time they're used as a means to get into more intense forms of plyos. Today I'm going to go through what things you should be focusing on with extensive plyometrics, some misconceptions, and ways in which you can use them to better improve the way that you are programming plyometrics for yourself or for your athletes. So what are extensive plyometrics? Dr. Verkhoshansky, the godfather of plyometrics, categorized plyometrics as maximal and submaximal. Now, this today is seen as intense or extensive, and it's very similar in the way that it's approached, in that we are using almost max intent based movements in our intensive or maximal based plyometrics, obviously, and our extensive submaximal stuff is kind of everything below that. There is something in that where I think that we need to really pay attention to what's happening with this idea of extensive plyometrics. So if we look at extensive plyometrics, ultimately the goal is still for it to be relatively reactive and dynamic in the way that we move when we cover ground. So all landings and ground contact times should still stay relatively fast. Where people are getting it twisted, I think, is that their extensivity drops so low that the movements are nowhere near plyometric. What I mean by not being plyometric is that we are not getting the effect on the tendons that we wish. Our tendons are our big force producers and passive force contributors that are giving us those reflexive pops and truly dynamic, explosive activities. So if you're so far away from exposing the tendon to considerable force, it is not going to be stretched and it's not going to give you the energy back that you're hoping for. So when I program plyometrics, I'll use 3 tiers and 3 structures of ways in which you can increase intensity through an extensive form and into an intensive form of plyometrics. So with a very rudimentary level of plyometrics, we start at plus plyos with the light tier. Now you can see a couple of movements here. It shows you that these movements are very light on the feet, as per se in the name. Ground contact times are still relatively fast, so that gives us a little bit of reactivity to work with, and it's going to give us that dynamic pop out of the movement. What's taken away here is the intent to push the output side of that takeoff. Now, staying with that extensive realm, we're also looking then at what's classed as submaximal forms of plyometrics, or as I term them, the medium tier. The medium tier is a form of movement really that is pretty close to intensive forms of plyometrics, but actually carries a little state of relaxation. And it's really where a lot of your work should be done with regards to learning movement patterns and actually getting to a place where you can do a really high volume of this sort of work. That's going to help build tissue tolerance. It's going to help build the tissue capacity. It's going to give you the skills that you need to deliver the punch at the right time. And then obviously we have our intense plyometrics. And realistically, all of these levels of plyos should look the same with regards to the reactivity on the ground when it comes to true plyometric manner of actions. What happens is those outputs then increase as you ramp up the intent to produce a larger takeoff. So our extensive plyometrics have a bit more of a structure with regards to a very light rudimentary movement into submaximal, and then we step into intensive forms. Now, misconceptions with extensive plyometrics come wholeheartedly in that extensive realm. Where does a movement become not so plyometric? It may be that you're using what you think to be an extensive plyometric when really it's per se not getting the stretch reflex that you want from the series elastic component or tendon. It's maybe too slow on the ground, and that therefore doesn't give you the output that you'd wish for or the velocity of that output. So it's really important to place value on the level of intent or intensity that you're looking at. So if you're dropping below 60% or even 70% in some regards of maximal intensity, And that might, well, it definitely is more self-prescribed in terms of how you feel it subjectively. You have to be aware that it's likely that those movements are not working the tendon as you would like them to with true forms of plyometrics. Another misconception is treating extensive forms of plyometrics as a means to an end and getting you from a starting point into intense forms. Extensive plyometrics are your number one place to really develop tissue, that being the muscle, tendons, and the ligaments. We really struggle to be able to develop this side of tissue tolerance, capacity, and just overall tensile strength based on very few landings that you can do in intense forms of plyometrics in comparison to submaximal forms. So although I think that there's value in doing it in very rudimentary extensive forms of plyometrics, where you'll truly get change is in the submaximal medium tier levels. It is really twisted in that we assume that we just have to end up at the intense form of plyometrics, when really there is true value in those high number of volume work that we're going to be doing with the medium tier and submaximal movements, but also our capacity to do things in multi-directional ways. We're very limited as humans when it comes to intense forms of plyometrics to move multi-directionally. So you'll struggle to go laterally, you'll struggle to go backwards and truly exert or actually be exposed to maximal intent-based plyometrics or forces. That's why there's a lot of value in making sure that you use extensive plyometrics year-round in time with more intense forms. It might be that you place more of a focus on one of those modalities at a given time. So if you're doing a high volume of extensive plyometrics, the likelihood is that the intense forms will reduce in volume and vice versa. So what can you take away from this with regards to extensive plyometrics? Extensive forms of movement are your initial stepping stone into learning all the movement patterns that you need to learn with regards to plyos. So we want you to be able to leap off of 2 feet, to do a split stance leap off 2 feet, to be able to do a split exchange off of 2 feet. We want you then to scale that up into bounding from one leg to the other, and then eventually get to the most intense form of a movement itself, and that is to hop on a single leg. Ultimately, when we learn in more extensive manners, in more relaxed states, we're able to take on a lot more information and we are able to build on movement landing skills. We learn proprioceptively, we increase our capacity to pre-anticipate the ground, and in doing so, this improves the stiffness on the ground and how well we use energy and couple it effectively from that incoming momentum to outgoing momentum. We also have that ability again to increase the volume of work that we're doing. You have a much higher capacity to use higher volumes in extensive forms of plyometrics. So make this a place for you, number one, to learn as we go back to, but secondly, to improve those tissue qualities. Extensive plyometrics are super valuable. They should be in your program now. If you're unsure as to how to program them, you need to go to plusplyos.com. Make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. And tell me what other kind of videos you'd like me to dig into with regards to training within the jumps and plyometric realms. Thanks.